A civilization can survive error more easily than uncertainty. That was the terrible paradox facing Rome when Galileo Galilei stood before judgment in AD 1633. The question was never only whether Earth moved around the sun. The deeper question was who held the right to declare what counted as truth in a continent already tearing itself apart over that very issue. To understand Galileo's trial, the lens must widen far beyond one astronomer, one pope, or one famous recantation. The stage was Europe after the Protestant Reformation, a fractured civilization in which theology had become geopolitics, interpretation had become power, and disagreement had become a kind of strategic contagion. Between AD 1545 and AD 1563, the Council of Trent hardened Catholic doctrine and clarified institutional lines in response to Protestant revolt. This was not mere theological housekeeping. It was an act of regime stabilization. Protestantism had advanced in part by challenging who could interpret scripture, tradition, and authority itself. Therefore the Catholic response could not simply be spiritual renewal, though it contained that. It also had to be a reassertion of jurisdiction. In such an age, interpretation was not a harmless scholarly pastime. It was bound up with obedience, legitimacy, and the survival of institutions. The old medieval synthesis had promised a broad coherence between the cosmos, reason, and revelation. Aristotelian natural philosophy, scholastic method, and inherited readings of scripture existed in mutual support. The heavens seemed orderly, hierarchical, and stable, and so too did the social vision attached to them. But Europe in the late 16th and early 17th centuries was not stable. Dynasties fought for supremacy, confessions competed for souls, and rulers feared not merely military defeat but epistemic unraveling. If one authority could be publicly contradicted, perhaps another could be as well. If one inherited reading proved flawed, what protected the rest? This was the strategic atmosphere into which the telescope arrived. In AD 1610, Galileo published observations that did not simply enrich astronomy. They destabilized an intellectual alliance that had endured for centuries. Mountains on the moon suggested the heavens were not made of some entirely different perfect substance. Moons around Jupiter suggested not everything revolved around Earth. The phases of Venus dealt a punishing blow to the old Ptolemaic arrangement. These findings mattered because they turned speculation into spectacle. Ideas that had once remained largely in the custody of learned debate now entered a widening public world through print, correspondence, demonstration, and reputation. Yet the familiar legend of blind religion crushing enlightened science is too simple to survive serious scrutiny. The Roman Church was not intellectually primitive, nor was it uniformly hostile to inquiry. Jesuit astronomers observed celestial phenomena with discipline and sophistication. Clerics sponsored scholarship. Colleges taught mathematics and natural philosophy. Rome often absorbed new knowledge when that knowledge could be integrated without surrendering institutional command over interpretation. The problem, therefore, was not curiosity alone. The problem was jurisdiction. A confessional age cannot tolerate ambiguity the way a self-confident civilization might. Not easily. Not when every concession risks being weaponized by rivals. If nature could publicly contradict respected authorities, then a pressing political question emerged: who governed the boundary between legitimate reinterpretation and dangerous rebellion? This was the hidden center of the Galileo affair. The telescope had not simply revealed new objects in the sky. It had exposed a weakness in the machinery by which authority validated reality. Another accelerant intensified the danger. Print culture and patronage had created a competitive marketplace of ideas. Discovery was no longer only about truth. It also delivered status, factions, patrons, enemies, and publicity. A learned claim, once printed and circulated, became difficult to contain. A new astronomical argument could cross borders faster than institutional review could restrain it. Therefore scholars became strategists, patrons became protectors, and intellectual life became inseparable from prestige politics. In that world, Galileo was not merely a man of science. He was a virtuoso of advancement. Galileo's ascent was a masterpiece of early modern self-fashioning. Brilliant in mathematics and observation, certainly. But also sharp in controversy, theatrical in presentation, and fully aware that truth without influence often remained powerless. He understood how to turn discovery into public drama. He understood how to provoke admiration and resentment in equal measure. Above all, he understood patronage. When Galileo identified the moons of Jupiter, he named them the Medicean stars in honor of the Medici. This was not trivial flattery. It was a political maneuver of rare precision. In early modern Europe, knowledge required shelter. A thinker advanced not only by proving a claim but by attaching that claim to a house, a court, a prince, or a network powerful enough to defend it. Galileo did not merely observe the heavens. He converted the heavens into capital. Through Medici favor, his status rose dramatically. He gained position, visibility, and the kind of symbolic armor that courtly association could provide. But patronage cuts both ways. It elevates, yet it also exposes. A figure who becomes too famous ceases to be just a scholar. He becomes a public test case. Every triumph acquires political meaning. Every insult gains witnesses. Every argument becomes a factional signal. Galileo's gifts as a polemicist intensified this dynamic. He possessed extraordinary intellectual confidence, but confidence of that sort often tempts a thinker to believe that superior reasoning can neutralize institutional anxiety. History rarely grants such mercy. Here another central player enters, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, among the most formidable Catholic theologians of the age. Bellarmine was not an enemy of thought. He was an administrator of boundaries. In AD 1616, as debates over Copernicanism intensified, Rome delivered a subtle but crucial message. Heliocentrism could be discussed hypothetically as a mathematical model. But it could not be asserted as established physical truth. This distinction may appear evasive to later minds, but strategically it was elegant. It allowed inquiry without public surrender. It permitted calculation without institutional humiliation. It preserved the Church's ability to supervise interpretation while avoiding an immediate total war against new astronomy. Bellarmine's warning to Galileo was therefore not a simple ban on thinking. It was an attempt to freeze the question within manageable procedural limits. But such compromises depend on restraint from all parties, and restraint was not the defining trait of the age. Galileo believed, with substantial reason, that the evidence favored the Copernican view. Yet the evidence by the standards of the time was suggestive rather than conclusive. Here the fog of war enters the intellectual battlefield. Today the broad arc of the scientific revolution makes heliocentrism appear destined. But historical actors never stand inside destiny. They stand inside uncertainty. Stellar parallax had not yet been observed. Galileo's own favored proof, based on the tides, was incorrect. The physics of motion remained incomplete. Therefore what later ages would celebrate as clear truth still existed then within an unresolved field of argument. That mattered enormously. Not because Rome was right in substance, but because procedural ambiguity gave Rome room to act. Then fortune seemed to tilt in Galileo's favor. In AD 1623, Maffeo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII. Barberini was cultured, intelligent, and initially sympathetic to Galileo. Here, for a moment, appeared the possibility of reconciliation. A celebrated natural philosopher and an intellectually sophisticated pope might together demonstrate that Catholic authority could accommodate inquiry without surrendering doctrinal dignity. This was Galileo's opening, and perhaps his greatest temptation. Yet power is never static. Urban VIII did not reign in a vacuum. Europe was convulsed by the 30 Years' War, one of the great catastrophes of the age. Confessional conflict, dynastic rivalry, strategic insecurity, and the fragility of papal influence all pressed upon Rome. A pope in such conditions could not afford to appear weak in matters touching authority. Public control mattered. Ceremonial prestige mattered. The image of command mattered. Therefore what may seem in calmer times a dispute among educated men became, under pressure, a test of whether the hierarchy still governed the boundaries of acceptable thought. Into this climate Galileo released the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems in AD 1632. It remains one of the great works of scientific argument and literary craft. But greatness in argument does not always equal wisdom in timing. The dialogue outwardly presented a balanced discussion between competing cosmologies. But many in Rome read it as advocacy for heliocentrism under the cover of dialogue. Worse still, they perceived an insult. The character Simplicio, defender of traditional views, appeared to echo arguments associated with Urban VIII himself. Whether Galileo intended ridicule or merely failed to appreciate how the structure would be received, the effect was politically disastrous. In a tense court, perception becomes reality faster than evidence can rescue intention. This was Galileo's strategic blunder. He underestimated how much papal vanity and institutional insecurity mattered. Men under pressure do not evaluate criticism as abstract reason. They evaluated as a challenge to rank, to face, to command. Urban VIII now had reasons beyond astronomy to act. If a thinker favored by the papacy could appear to embarrass the Pope publicly and still escape correction, what signal would that send through a Europe already alive with confessional defiance? Compromise, once honorable, became expensive. The issue hardened. Once a high-profile thinker appears to challenge not only a theory but the hierarchy that arbitrates truth, institutions shift from persuasion to demonstration. The target is no longer merely the argument. The target becomes the precedent. That is how Galileo's trial must be understood. In AD 1633, the proceedings before the Roman Inquisition were not simply a referendum on astronomy. They were a contest between rival systems for producing certainty. One system drew authority from inherited theological and institutional jurisdiction. The other increasingly drew authority from observation, mathematical reasoning, and the public reproducibility of claims. Neither system was fully formed in the modern sense. Both still moved through patronage, status, rhetoric, and incomplete evidence. But their methods were diverging, and in Galileo's case they collided face to face. The Inquisition's central questions were procedural. Did Galileo violate the AD 1616 injunction? Did he present heliocentrism as truth rather than hypothesis? These were not trivial distinctions in Roman eyes. They provided the legal architecture for discipline. This is the cold genius of institutions under threat. They seldom punish the broadest issue directly when narrower procedural grounds will suffice. Procedure converts anxiety into legitimacy. It transforms a struggle for authority into an appearance of orderly governance. Galileo's defenders could point to his brilliance, his discoveries, and the momentum of new astronomy. But Rome possessed the courtroom, the records, the machinery of interrogation, and the ability to define what counted as obedience. The asymmetry was decisive. Galileo had intellectual momentum and elite fame. Rome had legal authority, theological jurisdiction, and coercive prestige. Therefore the verdict would be shaped by more than the truth of the cosmos. It would be shaped by the needs of a regime managing uncertainty. Galileo's evidentiary position, moreover, was vulnerable enough to exploit. The absence of observed stellar parallax still posed a genuine problem. His tidal theory, meant to prove Earth's motion, was wrong. The full Newtonian synthesis that would later clarify celestial mechanics did not yet exist. This did not invalidate heliocentrism. But it did prevent Galileo from closing the case by the standards available at the time. In moments of institutional stress, incomplete proof becomes permission for suppression. A regime need not defeat an idea conclusively if it can delay recognition while maintaining command. Thus the trial became less about discovery than about timing. Galileo had much of the future on his side. Rome had the present. In political struggle, the present usually strikes first. The sentence fell with symbolic force. Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy, compelled to abjure, and condemned to house arrest. The public meaning was unmistakable. A celebrity intellectual had been disciplined. The hierarchy had asserted its right to police doctrinal and interpretive frontiers. A civilizational question, for the moment, had been answered not by broad scholarly consensus but by authority backed by force. Yet history's deepest verdicts are rarely rendered on the day a sentence is pronounced. In the short term, Rome won. That must be stated plainly. It demonstrated control. It signaled that doctrinal borders remained guarded. It reminded scholars, clerics, and courts across Catholic Europe that prestige did not place anyone above supervision. This was not irrational in institutional terms. Leaders under siege often calculate that visible leniency invites wider erosion. From within the defensive logic of the Counter-Reformation, firmness could appear prudent. The Church had endured schism, polemical assault, political encirclement, and the ceaseless danger that private interpretation might become public fragmentation. To discipline Galileo was to perform certainty at a time when certainty itself had become a security asset. But there is a tragic law in the history of power. Institutions may win a confrontation and lose the narrative that follows. Galileo's condemnation elevated him beyond the status of a controversial scholar. It transformed him into a symbol. A thinker disciplined by authority acquires a second life in posterity, especially when later evidence vindicates what authority constrained. The Republic of Letters, that sprawling transnational network of correspondence and publication, increasingly shifted northward and outward, into zones less constrained by Roman censorship. Suppression did not stop inquiry. It changed its geography. Galileo himself, though confined, did not vanish intellectually. His discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences, published in Leiden in AD 1638 beyond the immediate reach of Roman control, helped lay foundational stones for modern physics. Here the irony sharpened. Rome had contained the man, but not the method gathering around him. It had disciplined the celebrity, but not the emerging habits of inquiry that would define the coming centuries. The trial thus marks a hinge in civilizational power. Not because science suddenly triumphed in a single dramatic instant. History seldom works through clean revolutions of thought. Rather, confidence in where knowledge should be arbitrated began to migrate. The old monopoly weakened. Authority rooted mainly in inherited hierarchy found itself increasingly challenged by authority rooted in method, replication, and public demonstration. That transition was slow, uneven, and incomplete. But the direction became difficult to reverse. Here lies the largest lesson. Institutions often tolerate innovation until innovation threatens their monopoly on arbitration. They can accept new facts if those facts remain subordinate to existing channels of approval. But when innovation begins to imply that reality may be accessed, tested, and validated outside traditional guardianship, tolerance narrows. The dispute is no longer over information. It is over sovereignty. This pattern is not confined to churches. It belongs to bureaucracies, states, academies, parties, corporations, and all systems that convert authority into social order. So long as new knowledge can be absorbed without redistributing prestige, many institutions appear flexible. But once evidence threatens rank, memory, jurisdiction, or face, resistance hardens. At that point, arguments are judged not solely by their truth, but by their political timing, their symbolic implications, and the danger they pose to those tasked with appearing certain. Galileo's trial reveals another enduring law of human nature. Leaders under siege rarely distinguish calmly between correction and insubordination. The more fragile the authority, the more aggressively it may perform certainty. This is because uncertainty invites comparison, debate, and the possibility of rival loyalty. A confident order can absorb embarrassment. A brittle order must dramatize control. Therefore the harshness of response often tells less about the strength of the argument being suppressed than about the insecurity of the structure suppressing it. This is why the affair retains such force. It is not merely a relic of early modern theology. It is a permanent warning about the politics of knowledge. The familiar reduction of the story to faith versus science obscures more than it reveals. Galileo's judges were not simply villains in a fable of ignorance. They were actors inside a strategic system that had linked truth, order, and obedience so tightly that loosening one thread threatened the whole fabric. Their error was profound, but it was not simple. They mistook management of interpretation for mastery of reality. They believed a procedural victory could stabilize a changing world. For a moment, it could. For a century, it could not. Thus the verdict, as the historical dust settles, is severe and paradoxical. Rome won the case and lost the century. It succeeded in disciplining Galileo, preserving immediate authority, and warning the confessional world that doctrine would not be publicly revised by pressure from a famous natural philosopher. But the true cost was civilizational. By turning a contest of evidence into a spectacle of coercion, Rome damaged its credibility as an arbiter of emerging knowledge. It taught generations of thinkers that innovation would flourish more safely where jurisdiction was looser and where claims could be tested without being forced into ceremonies of submission. The institution preserved command. It forfeited trust. The modern mirror is uncomfortably clear. Whenever any institution, sacred or secular, treats uncertainty as intolerable and dissent as contagion, the logic of Galileo returns. It appears in governments that censor unwelcome data because appearances must be maintained. It appears in bureaucracies that punish internal critics more quickly than external failure. It appears in media systems, ideological movements, and expert cultures whenever preserving narrative authority becomes more urgent than correcting error. The names change. The instruments change. The temptation does not. Human beings build institutions to reduce chaos. But institutions, once established, often begin confusing their own continuity with the truth itself. From there the slide is perilously easy. A challenge to procedure becomes a challenge to legitimacy. A challenge to legitimacy becomes a threat to order. A threat to order authorizes suppression. And suppression, in the name of stability, slowly teaches the most ambitious minds to seek freer ground elsewhere. That is how centers of prestige decline, not only by losing wars or wealth, but by making themselves inhospitable to correction. Galileo's trial endures because it captures a universal flaw in organized power. Control of the narrative is seductive. It offers immediate calm, visible discipline, and the illusion that contradiction has been mastered. But control of the narrative is not control of reality. Reality waits. It accumulates. It outlives decrees. The final legacy question, therefore, is not whether the past was foolish enough to put a scientist on trial. The deeper question is this: when any civilization becomes frightened enough, what truths does it forbid, not because they are false, but because they arrive from the wrong mouths, at the wrong time, in a way that threatens the guardians of certainty? If this analysis sharpened the way power and knowledge are understood, subscribe for historical examinations that go beyond events and expose the strategic logic beneath them. And for the next chapter, the end screen leads to another story where authority, fear, and unintended consequences collide in ways no empire can fully control. One question remains worth carrying into that next video: when institutions punish an idea, does that usually reveal the weakness of the idea, or the insecurity of the institution?